You're Missing Out is sponsored by Audible. As part of my New Year's resolution, I told myself I'd read more and listen to new audiobooks. With Audible, it's easier than ever to find titles and time in my routine to reach my goal. Every month, members get 1 credit to pick any title, plus 2 Audible originals from a monthly selection, as well as access to daily news digests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Right now, you can visit audibletrial.com/YMO podcast and get 2 audiobooks on behalf of the show. You can download thousands of different titles and listen offline, anytime, anywhere. Download the free Audible app on your favorite smartphone and tablet devices without ever losing your spot. Having a hard time deciding what to listen to? No worries. You can keep your credits for up to a year and use them to binge on a whole series if you'd like. This is the best way to find a new title to fall in love with, all while supporting your favorite National Film Registry podcast. Once again, that's audibletrial.com/YMO podcast to start your free trial and get 2 free audiobooks on us. Thank you for your support.
And now, on with the show.
All aboard, fellas. What's the first action movie you remember seeing?
Well, for me, may have been something beforehand, but I was maybe too young to remember. Like, I'm sure I saw, Batman and Batman Returns when I was younger, but I don't remember the exact act of watching them. But I do know that my father, in his ways, got a hold of a jailbroken cable box, so we had all the pay-per-view channels for free. And when I was young, I distinctly remember in our old Brooklyn home, hanging out in the living room, watching Die Hard with a Vengeance a lot and loving it. It's a great forbearance for where my tastes were going to lie in the future. I was a big old action boy. I loved me some Bruce Willis. I loved me some good old racial tension with Bruce and Sam in that movie, and it was just a great movie, and one when I revisited when I was older, I was like, yeah, this is actually a good movie and not something that got the childhood rose-colored glasses making me think they were good. So Die Hard with a Vengeance was my first action movie I remember watching.
Much like Tom, I have movies that I know I watched. I mean, I've probably said it before on the show. The first ever movie that I would have seen was my father holding his newborn child in his arms watching Batman 89 on HBO. And in terms of action films, if you count Aladdin from Disney as an action film, I'm sure I saw that sometime as a kid. But in terms of remember seeing, it's actually more in line with the first movie that I ever saw in terms of I remember vividly going to the theater, even though I was very little. It was 95, going to the theater to see Batman Forever. And what an incredible thing that felt like, because I remember I used to watch Batman the Animated Series as a kid, and obviously Batman's punching out, Two-Face and the Riddler on my TV, but now he's giant on a big screen doing it, and how cool that was. And everything about it felt like, oh, this is amazing. How are people not freaking out about this? This is incredible. And really it meant a lot to me as a kid, Batman Forever. Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, we're discussing what's considered to be one of the first action movies. Mike Scott from the podcast Action for Everyone joins the show to discuss 1903's The Great Train Robbery. Our guest today is the host of Adkins Undisputed, the most complete Scott Adkins podcast in the world, and one of my favorite people on what we could call action film Twitter. Mike Scott joins us today to talk about The Great Train Robbery. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm not going to lie, I'm a little intimidated to be on this show because you guys talk about, real movies, and you have people like Vice and Matt Singer on who are way smarter. I'm just an idiot who likes movies where people get kicked in the face. So I'm excited to be here, but I'm a little intimidated.
All right, listen, number one, you say that shit, but you do a podcast where you get to talk about Universal Soldier Day of Reckoning, which is, I'm not being ironic, is one of the best movies I've ever seen. So stow that humble bullshit right now and just know you are more than welcome on this show where sometimes we got to talk about, KKK propaganda.
Yeah, that's one of the rough ones. That's season 4's real rough one. But I will say, I will say I'm a fan of your show. I found your show when a friend of our show, Vice Victus, was on. And what's interesting about it is that I am not the biggest action movie guy. Tom knows this. I'm certainly not an expert on the DTV world or anything like that. So I figured I would listen to the episode Vice was on, support him. And then I found that I kept listening. Because even if you're not a Scott Adkins obsessive, I think that your show is so well done, kind of walking people through the importance of these films, without being afraid to be critical sometimes when something doesn't quite pan out. Like, oh god, what the hell was the zombie film? I'm forgetting the name of now.
Re-Kill.
Re-Kill. Thank you. Yeah, I'm a big fan of your show. It's a great show, and
Yeah, it's a great show.
when we knew that Great Train Robbery was coming up, I just remember saying to Tom, like, this is the guy I want to get on for this. I think it would be so interesting to kind of have you on for what is technically not, but also kind of the very first action movie, right? And how it evolves from this 13-minute thriller packing Nickelodeons to the kind of films that you talk about today. That fascinating over a century evolution, which is a lot of, it's an interesting thing. And also, if that doesn't count for anything, I'm pretty sure Scott Adkins fights somebody on a train in one of the Ninja movies, right? One or two.
Subway in Ninja 1. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. I had a feeling you'd have that pull ready, so. So before we get any further into the Great Train Robbery, let's talk about what the National Film Registry had to say about the Great Train Robbery. Considered the first narrative film, The Great Train Robbery was directed and photographed by Edwin S. Porter, a former cameraman for the Thomas Edison Company. Primitive by modern standards, the 10-minute action picture depicts 14 distinct scenes filmed at various locales in New Jersey intended to represent the American West. Broncho Billy Anderson, the screen's first Western star, played several roles in the film, including a bandit and a train passenger. Audiences were thrilled and terrified to watch a gunman in medium close-up fire directly at the screen in the film's final scene, although Porter suggested to exhibitors that it could just as easily be shown at the beginning of the film instead. So that's what the Library of Congress had to say about the Great Train Robbery. Mike, had you seen the Great Train Robbery before?
I had seen it years and years and years ago when I was in a film class, but I honestly, obviously, if you are at all a film fan, that last shot is just so much in the kind of the cultural zeitgeist that like you remember that, but I didn't remember anything else about it. So rewatching it was kind of a fun experience to see it again, basically for the first time.
Yeah, it's a Tom, and obviously I believe you and I had seen it together in
Oh, yeah.
film school, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the movies we saw in film school. And I mean, like Mike, it was kind of, just a thing. Didn't really remember it. I mean, God, I've watched 400 movies this year alone. So, my mind's been wiped clean of 12-minute footage from 1903 that I saw like 15 years ago. So, yeah, I mean, it was nice and fresh. And, yeah, I mean, we talk about Rosetta Stones in cinema a lot, and this is pretty much the Rosetta Stone of all Rosetta Stones,
It's fascinating because I think that for this podcast in particular, what's kind of fun for us doing the National Film Registry as opposed to like an AFI list or anything is that if you were doing just a greatest films list or anything like that, you're only getting one type of movie. The Library of Congress, because of what they've inducted in the registry, we're going to be going as far back as stuff from 1894 and these one-reelers of just blacksmiths hitting things. What I think is interesting about the Great Train Robbery and its place in the registry in general is I would venture to say it's perhaps the oldest movie that we're ever going to cover that it stops being something we watch just for historical value, and there is actually real visceral entertainment still in it. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but for me, like watching it again, I wasn't just sitting back with a notepad going, the historical. There are moments that are still fun to watch, despite this being well over a century old.
Well, it's fun to be like, oh, back in 1903, they knew what people wanted. They wanted action. They wanted fun. They wanted to see bad guys doing bad things and then getting their comeuppance. You know, I was going to tweet this, but I figured whatever, I'll make the joke on the show. But it's like, I'm trying to imagine people today watching, you know, this short in college and being like, "Excuse me, you want me to sympathize with these train robbers?" That's pretty problematic, guys. But yeah, I mean, like what did I see? And the guys that did this were like, yeah, people want this pulp shit. They want guns and they want robberies and they want exciting shit. Like, what are we gonna do? A gritty neorealistic movie about how like we still don't know how to do medicine and we're like drilling into people's heads if they have too many headaches? Like, no, they're making fun shit.
It's interesting you say that. So that brings us to Edwin S. Porter, who is the filmmaker behind this. Obviously, he's not known as a director because at the time they were called producers rather than directors was the term for the kind of the visionary on this. But Edwin S. Porter actually got his start working for a museum in New York. It was like an attractions place. We used to have a lot of places that were halls of amusement in a way. We called them museums, but they were really kind of like amusement halls, right? Where they would have wax figures and grotesqueries and things like that. Porter worked for a place called the Eden Musée, which was an amusement center and wax museum on 23rd Street here in New York. If you guys are wondering exactly where, if you're a New Yorker, it's the P.C. Richards and Sons on 23rd Street. Used to be one of the most important locations in cinema history. That's how we treat our history here in New York. Anyway, Porter worked for the Eden Musée, and he would screen newsreel footage for people that were just, you know, in the late 1800s, films were just documentary footage, right? They were just non-narrative, like footage of things happening. And what Porter noticed was that the war footage built around the Spanish-American War was what gripped people the most. And seeing the crowd's reaction to footage of war scenes more so than watching, I don't know, somebody feed a cat, influenced his idea of what he was going of what he would eventually produce in his own films. The understanding of this is what the audience is responding to. And he started out, when he started working for Hearst and then Edison, he started out making films that were reenactments of historical events that contained a bit of viscerality, right? He showed a couple, the Bunding Brothers, I believe it is. It was basically a short recreation of a posse killing a bunch of robbers. Him and Edison, who was essentially the original exploitation filmmaker in a way. You know, Edison was the one who sent. Here's an interesting one. Edison sent Edwin S. Porter to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo to film President McKinley. Porter unknowingly was filming McKinley the day before McKinley would be shot. So Edison told him, go film the funeral. And their footage of Bill McKinley's funeral broke box office records and became the biggest hit film of its year. As a result, to try and capitalize on that, Edison then demanded they film a recreation of the execution of McKinley's assassination, Leon Czolgosz. Sold that as the real thing, and again, another massive hit. So Edison was very much about trying to give the audience what they wanted. Porter, while doing that, seemed interested in expanding the medium and trying to create something a little more artistic than just visceral thrills, which that combination, I think, is what ultimately results in the movie we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, you know, it's not dissimilar from what guys like Sergei Eisenstein or even Frank Capra were doing later when they were, you know, recruited to make propaganda stuff for their respective nations. And while it was propaganda, they still managed to make pretty staggeringly amazing, you know, pieces of cinema on top of that. It's always, I mean, it's funny. This is a perfect example of that whole art commerce thing that we're still dealing with today, right? And still dealing with sensationalized things, and audiences want, you know, real life footage of executions and stuff like that. And then you need an artist kind of to make that. So they end up still ultimately trying to do something with it that goes beyond just that sort of salaciousness and that need to feed the lowest common denominator.
It's interesting too. You're right. And Porter, actually, we don't know much about Porter's life before his work at the Eden Musée, but I was able to find an interesting quote from him after Great Train Robbery. A little after that, he was tasked, because the film industry was so big. Porter was tasked with turning out a 15-minute film every 3 days, and Porter is quoted as saying, "The bane of the producer," which we got to remember in this time means director. "The bane of the producer is the rule requiring the turning loose of so many reels of film per week, regardless entirely of surrounding circumstances. We must allow sufficient time to do those things which should be done, and avoid those things which should not be done." So even back in the early 1900s, you are already having conflicts between the filmmaker and the studio about quantity versus quality. Already all the way back then.
And filming time, which is
Yeah.
still to this day a problem. Getting worse these days. If you talk to anybody who works in B movies, it's basically every producer's like, "Well, you made your last movie for $500,000. What if we did it for $300,000 this time? And instead of 14 days, you have 10 days." And you go, "Well, just shoot me in the head then, because that's just not going to be easy at all, and it's going to look like crap." But things don't change. Time's a flat circle.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that is in my wheelhouse, and I can tell you, having talked to Scott and talked to some other, DTV folks, they've made entire action movies in less time than Jackie Chan took to film the last fight in Drunken Master 2. I mean, it's absolutely insane, the timetables that people are dealing with. You're turning around full-length features with, like you said, Tom, 10 to 14 days shooting time. You're trying, if you're in action, to do sort of, at least if you're good at it, like Scott or Michael Jai White, you're trying to do some fairly high level martial arts and fight scenes. And where normally you might have had a week or two to shoot those scenes, you're now trying to shoot them in a day or two. And it's absolutely unreal. But this is just a perfect example of, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? Like, the film industry hasn't actually evolved all that much since 1993.
No. It all started with the separation of powers between the guys with money who don't know a fucking thing about making movies because they don't go to the set, and then they just get the film and go, "Well, that must have been easy. Why don't you do it again, but shorter, if it was that easy?" And then you have, filmmakers losing their goddamn minds because it wasn't easy. Give us more time, please.
Well, that's Thomas Edison to a T. Edison, his name is on all these films, but he wasn't involved in the filmmaking process. He just had the facilities and he had the patents. I was looking into this because, yesterday when I knew we had this episode coming, I was doing my research and I was looking into, this film and how it got made and where it was made. And I saw that it was in Essex County, New Jersey. So I decided on a whim. I actually drove out to Jersey. We're in New York, so it was about an hour and a half drive. And I went to the park where they filmed the exteriors and the train tracks where they filmed the train sequences. And most interesting, you can go to West Orange, New Jersey, and you can actually see they have a replica of the Black Maria studio, which was Edison's film studio, which is a tiny thing. It's about the size of maybe like a small house, where this is the original film studio. And why it's called Black Maria for some reason is because they said it looked like a police paddy wagon. That doesn't explain the name anymore. It's something that's kind of lost in translation a bit. You look at it and you kind of just realize, like, right, for Edison, he essentially had this compound, built this small black box on there, hired William Dixon and then later Edwin S. Porter, and kind of just went, "Go into that box, here's some money, here's some cameras, here's some films, make stuff that will give me money." And that was it. And initially there was seemingly minimal oversight. And then once the money started rolling in, and once these things became more and more profitable, all of a sudden you start to see Edison upping the mandates and giving them less and expecting more. And it's just immediate, like, it's exactly what we see now. It's the same thing.
Tell me Thomas Edison was a piece of shit who liked to take credit for things he didn't really do, and took advantage of every loophole he could and tried to, get a copyright on every movie ever made because he invented the camera.
Yeah,
Like,
well, I was going to
like a real
say,
asshole.
do you know, Mike, do you know about William Dixon and Thomas Edison's sort of rivalry?
Yeah, I do know a little bit about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that is essentially where, for our listeners, that's essentially where the Great Train Robbery kind of springs out of the fact that Edison was forced to innovate. Because for a while, his rivals were Biograph, which was William Dixon had left Edison and formed Biograph. Our listeners from last season might remember Biograph is where D.W. Griffith got his start. In order to stop Biograph from making 35mm films, Edison claimed that he had a patent on all the equipment, which shut Biograph out and forced them to make 69mm films until 1902, when a patent lawsuit took Biograph's side, which meant that Edison now had to innovate in new ways, allowing Edwin S. Porter to experiment with this crazy idea that he had that never caught on of what if you had narrative scenes in sequence to tell a story. Which, could you imagine, fellas, if that had caught on at all?
Who could have ever seen that? It's not like it would have taken over all of our lives in annoying ways.
The thing that I find so just fascinating and depressing about this is it's pretty clear, Edison viewed these movies as, well, they were advertisements, right? They were advertisements for him to sell his shit. And it's just so depressing how that has just never changed, right? That the studios view movies as they're the ads for their secondary revenue streams, basically. Everything is, my wife and I have a long-running joke how I am completely impervious to advertisements, like advertisements on TV shows, commercial breaks, stuff like that. Completely impervious. They don't faze me at all. Product placement,
Yep.
I am fucking powerless against. Like, if I see some character in a movie wearing like a cool pair of shoes, like, I gotta go buy those shoes. Like, I own like 7 pairs of Vans because Paul Walker wears them in the Fast and Furious movies. Like, I am powerless against product placement. And you can just see, even back then, that was the way the producer, the money people viewed these movies.
I mean, if you're talking about being a slave to product placement, Mike, let me introduce you to Mike.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm susceptible to all of that. I love it. I embrace it fully. I am.
You should ask us to send you the audio file of me yelling at Mike and Kyle about how they need to go get the Travis Scott McDonald's burger.
Well, now they're. Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, to your point about buying things you saw in movies, that's why I believe you ordered the exact bandana that the bandit who shoots the camera at the end wears, right?
Yep, I'm waiting for it to get here. It's not here yet, but I'm waiting for it. It's sometimes you got to go on an eBay hunt to find that stuff, but I did it.
Well, thank God bandanas are back in style again. I mean, if there's one benefit of the last 18 months, it's we could all look like old school cowboys while we go into banks, and this time nobody cares that we're wearing bandanas.
But I think it's interesting you're talking about Edison and that. I mean, even if you guys watch the execution of Leon Czolgosz film that they made, before they put Czolgosz in the electric chair, they make sure to show you that they tested the electric chair using Edison light bulbs, which is just so fun. That Edison's like, well, this is good enough to kill a man. Keep it in your home. It's interesting, though, that you say that, because one of the things Porter, you talk about, disreputable business practices. We didn't have real rules about copyright in the early 1900s, right? So the reason that Porter really shifts his approach to film and discovers new filmmaking techniques is, as you all may recall, in 1902, Georges Méliès makes a little film called A Trip to the Moon, which we've all seen. It's the iconic image of the rocket ship going into the moon's eye. It's an incredible work of early science fiction. Edison had Porter making pirated copies of the film to distribute. So he just had Porter pirating the movie. And Porter observed it and was inspired by its use of continuity of image and the idea of that you could show the exterior of something from one angle and then the interior from another angle. And the audience would understand what that meant, which sounds very obvious now, but at the time that was pretty cool and pretty wild, because you got to remember a lot of early films, for our listeners, a lot of the early films that precede this are just a camera set up on a tripod, filming one thing happening in one take. But from Méliès, Porter discovered some of these ideas, like interior and exterior, continuity of images, and even match cuts. He would incorporate those into his films, and people were so impressed. If you watch, he had an early short called Appointment by Telephone. It's a 3-scene short that's just about a guy cheating on his wife and getting caught, because early 1900s. But the big revolutionary thing is that he shows you a man standing in front of this restaurant, and then the next shot is him inside of it, and you're watching people walk past the window from the other angle, and people understood that. So then he does The Life of an American Fireman, which incorporates match cuts, where he'll show you the fireman swinging a pickaxe at a window, but he doesn't show it making contact until he cuts to the opposite angle. And all of these little things he's experimenting with all come into play when he decides he is going to make a film based on an old, I believe it's Butch Cassidy robbery. I may be mistaken on that, but I believe it's based on a Butch Cassidy train heist, which is, of course, the Great Train Robbery. And in this, you see one of the big things with this film, which we can talk about, is the fact that it cuts between so many different moments in time. It cuts between, the robbers on the train, the man in the station house, people having a hoedown. It cuts between all of them, and it never uses title cards to tell you where it is. There are no title cards besides the beginning of the movie, which I think is radical for a narrative, especially because so many silent films after that don't trust the audience enough. And even movies now don't trust the audience enough to figure something out.
It was really interesting for me that in terms of the editing, the thing I noticed that made it feel the sort of the most 1903 was the utter lack of camera movement, but the editing didn't radiate like old silent film at all. It felt fairly modern in terms of what you're talking about, the way it was cutting back and forth between different scenes and allowing us to just go with it and understand what was happening. And even if there's something, the hoedown, for instance, I was a little bit like, I'm guessing these guys are going to be the posse, but I'm not. But then, as soon as the station house manager comes in and tells them what happens, it's like, oh, okay, great. I know, the timeline collapses into itself, and you know exactly where you are and what place you're at. I was actually, I don't want to say I was surprised, because that feels like I'm talking down to the movie. I'm not at all, but I was pleased to see just kind of how modern the editing in this one felt.
Yeah, no, we do kind of deal with that a lot. Like I always say, I try to be as open-minded with older movies as I can, because I always get surprised, especially like you say with the editing or with this. Or one thing that really surprised me was the violence. I mean, the guy getting his head caved in and thrown off a train kind of took me by surprise. Yeah, I mean, I feel like no matter how hard we try and how much we consume, we're always just gonna have this idea of older movies as rickety or not as well conceived or whatever it is, or have the content that's adult or whatever. And then you watch it and you go, well, no, like I said, Rosetta Stone, this shit had to come from somewhere. And the editing, yeah, like the editing really was, I mean, I watched this shit and I feel like this is kind of, like I said, Rosetta Stone, the inkling, the seedling for the entirety of Michael Mann's career, basically. I mean, it's about the process of the robbery, and then that cross-cutting between the gang and the posse is, I mean, that's Public Enemies. That's heat. Like, it has to come somewhere, and Michael Mann might not even say, oh, it was the Great Train Robbery, but this all felt modern, man. Cops and robbers. People have been doing cops and robbers since the beginning.
Well, I mean, Scorsese straight up references this movie in Goodfellas, and as Ian said, it was a major influence on Goodfellas for him.
Oh, yeah. And I feel like maybe I'm reaching, but the posse dancing scene felt like the dancing scene at the wedding in Wolf of Wall Street. Just the way it's kind of shot straight on, of just them dancing, and it's like a comedic scene. until it's not, which is the Wolf of Wall Street to a T. But
Yeah.
like, I felt like, oh, he just straight up took another thing from the Great Train Robbery.
Well, and
But yeah,
also, to bring it back to Goodfellas, there's something about just like the way that and Bonnie and Clyde too. I mean, there's something about the way that this film is content to make. I mean, everybody is sort of faceless in it to some degree or another. But one of the things I think is so impressive about the film is you can get so invested in the action, despite this movie not doing what even film school would teach you to do, which is like introduce the audience to the characters. None of these people have names. We don't know anything about what their interests are outside of. We don't know why the guys are robbing the train. Nobody's got a sick kid at home. We don't know who the people are at the dance per se, and yet we're still invested in watching what happens to them. There's a real minimalism to the storytelling in this that I think makes it more effective than so many of the films that come along later that try and do the same thing. But yeah,
because simplicity is sometimes the most complex thing you can do. I mean, this thing just runs. This thing just starts. I mean, it's 12 minutes, and we say like, "Oh, it just starts," but like that, they could have spent like 2 or 3 minutes getting us to know the train station manager or whatever, or giving us a little bit on the leader of the gang. But it's just no. You know what this is. These are bad guys. They rob trains. They're robbing a train, and now they're gonna get shot. I mean, it's just simple, elemental. It's all about the execution of the story, which again feels like something that some movies do understand these days. Sometimes some movies could learn that lesson where it's really not about the story you're telling, but it's how you tell the story. Again, 1903, they figured that shit out. It's simple, but it's told well.
Yeah, I mean, us, action fans like me, we're always talking about pure action movies, right? Like
Yeah.
we want that pure action movie. That movie that's almost it's just one notch above like a demo reel, right? For a stunt
Yeah.
team. This is a demo reel for a fucking stunt team, man. This is as pure of an action movie as you can possibly get. Porter shoots everything. There's no close-ups until the very end, which I thought was fascinating. So because of the film quality and everything, you can't even really tell who these people are. You can tell those are the good guys, those are the bad guys, those are the victims. But it's all just pure kinetic action. And it's really kinetic. I was really impressed. Tom, you mentioned the violence. And especially, yeah, that dude getting his head beat in and then thrown off the train. I was like, damn, this movie's not fucking around here. But also just the shootouts and everything, everything, even though the camera isn't moving, which is, something that we'd be expecting to see now, everything within the frame is constantly moving. There is no moment of stillness anywhere in this movie. It is very kinetic. It's very visceral. And it's very clear that what Porter was really focused on was the action. He wanted to shoot action in a way that very likely hadn't been done before. I mean, honestly, watching this movie, I know it's kind of called, it's not technically correct, like you said, Mike, the first action movie, but man, Edwin Porter might be the first action director of all time, because this is some seriously, Michael Mann, to go to my DTV route, some serious John Hyams, Isaac Florentine shit that he's doing here. It's
Oh yeah.
I was really stunned at how much motion there was in this.
yes, it's technically not the first action movie or the first anything, but what I think is so interesting about that and that element of it is technically, and I'm using air quotes here, technically the first action movie could be attributed to The Burglars from 1897 by Alice Guy Blanche, which is cool enough. A woman directed possibly the first action film. But the first Western is arguably the British film Kidnapping by Indians from 1899. And the first crime film is arguably Chinese Laundry Scene from 1894. But in the case of all three of those, they are essentially 2 minutes, one camera on a tripod, filming one scene, adaptations of vaudeville routines. Chinese Laundry Scene is just a guy doing an acrobatics trick. The Burglars is people running across fake rooftops. Kidnapping by Indians speaks to itself. And the thing is, you watch all three of those, and they're just a camera capturing stunts that happen to have a setting. And you're right when you talk about Porter as the first action director, because to me, those other films that are called the first action movie or the first crime movie or the first Western movie, whatever, aren't. They're just scenes. They're just a single image with a costume thrown on it. This is an action movie. This is a crime movie because there's a narrative and a story and it's calibrated in such a way to elicit certain emotions from the audience.
Well, it's we talked about this on the we talked about this last year. I mean, we talk about this a lot, but it's that sometimes the first movie, the movie that's credited as being the first, we credit Birth of a Nation as the first like blockbuster, but it actually isn't. Other movies did these things before it. But it's really the case of the first movie to take all of those ideas and put it into a package that works. This took all of those ideas that came before it, added a little spice of its own, and made the first action movie because it's the first action movie that works. It does the thing that action movies need to do, which isn't just having stunts. It's having action dictate character. We may not know these guys, but by their actions, we know these robbers are vicious. They're not going to take any shit. And we know them more than if they spent time telling us about the wife with fucking typhoid and, sweating to death in a little fucking shack in the woods. Like, no, these guys will kill. They kill 3 innocent people in this movie, all done through action. We see how easily they get on the train, how they move, and all that stuff. It's not the first, but it's the first to put it all in a package. I mean,
and I go back to this quote a lot. I think of, and it's about a very different genre. But I remember watching a documentary about the history of the Broadway musical, and Harvey Fierstein was on there talking about Le Cage aux Folles, the big sensational musical, and he made a point that I always think of. People get it wrong. Le Cage aux Folles wasn't the first gay musical. It was the first gay musical to make money. And I always think of that when we talk about what movies are the first or anything like that, which is, was The Great Train Robbery technically the first action film or the first crime film? Maybe not, but it was the first to make, it was a massive hit. It was, it was culturally dominant. And when you think about the fact that maybe we could point to a different film that screened in a couple Nickelodeons or proto-Nickelodeons and say, well, that was technically the first action film. But if you think about how many of the early filmmakers saw The Great Train Robbery in their youth, in their infancy, and were inspired by it. I mean, everybody from John Ford to, quite literally, because he was invoked before, Walt Disney, saw this film. I mean, Walt Disney, I believe, had it playing in the Main Street Cinema back in the early days of Disneyland. Like, saw this movie and went, "Yeah, this is what a movie is. Like, this is what I'm trying to emulate." It is one of those films that you look at and realize kind of launched 1,000 artists because of what it did.
Well, I mean, it's to bring it to something, in our lifetimes. It's the Blair Witch Project.
Mm-hmm.
There were found footage movies before the Blair Witch Project. There was literally a found footage movie that wasn't too dissimilar from the Blair Witch Project, released before the Blair Witch Project, a year before, a movie called The Last Broadcast. But Blair Witch Project is the one that came together, had the package that just hooked everybody, made money, and then all of a sudden found footage is now a thing and not just sometimes a movie comes out that looks like it's shot like a documentary or someone found this tape. Nobody was really copying, other than the Italians, because that's what the Italians do, Cannibal Holocaust. Even though Cannibal Holocaust is more of a found footage movie 20 years before Blair Witch. I mean, it's just that thing, that elemental alchemy that is movies, where just because you're the first to do it doesn't mean you're the first to do it right, or the first to do it that connects in a big way. I mean, that's the sad and simple truth of this shit. Sometimes you got to be in the right place at the right time too.
And I think another element here with that, and I want to hear both you guys' thoughts on this element, that one thing that has kind of been lost to time, is that part of what makes Great Train Robbery so powerful is because it's a sequential narrative and scenes need to go in a certain order to convey the story. More control is in the hands of the producers in the studio making it rather than the exhibitors, because one thing we forget is how much control the exhibitors had over how a film was seen. I mean, think about the fact that earlier in 1903, I have this here that Edwin Porter adapted Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a hugely popular novel in America at the time. And there's a boat race scene that would either get placed as scene 5, where it made sense in the narrative, or scene 10, where it made no sense in the narrative, but just was more viscerally entertaining to the audience. Exhibitors were chopping up films and kind of like just putting things where they wanted to put them, clipping reels together however they wanted. Some exhibitors were hand tinting films. Others were adding their own sound effects behind the screen. The exhibitors kind of had free reign to do with this stuff whatever they wanted. And in the case of Great Train Robbery, as was noted, the scene that we all think of as the famous ending scene of the mid close-up and the guy shooting at the camera, some exhibitors were putting at the front. But I do think there's an element to Great Train Robbery because Porter had more control over the narrative and kind of do it his way. I think this film was able to have more of an impact because it took control out of the exhibitor's hands. A thing we forget about film is that how you watch it absolutely affects how you perceive the movie itself. If you're watching, the same movie that somebody saw in the cinema and thought was incredible, if you're watching it on your TV with motion smoothing and the brightness decreased and everything, you could say it looks terrible, but it's really the method of presentation.
Or if you're watching a movie at home, you're a goddamn heathen who deserves to be taken out back and shot.
Thank you, Film Twitter. We're glad you weighed in here.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Mike, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I'm kind of trying to formulate my thoughts about this too.
Yeah, no, because actually, perfect example. So I watched this twice. First time I watched it, I found just a version on YouTube, and it had a completely different color palette. So whatever print they were using was obviously had been tinted at some point, and it had your standard silent movie public domain backing. I mean, In the Hall of the Mountain King was used for a lot of it, because again, a lot of these silent movies, it was up to the exhibitors to decide whatever music they would, because they had a live person playing the piano there, and so it's just up to them. A lot of these movies, they don't have actual scores. They're just whatever music they wanted to play. But then I watched it on the Library of Congress YouTube channel, which they do have an official YouTube channel. It has no backing music whatsoever, and it's properly tinted. It's properly colored. It's not sepia toned. It's true black and white. And I will tell you, not having music kind of radically altered how this movie plays. It plays a hell of a lot nastier if you're just watching it in silence. Like, it is so much meaner if you're just sitting there watching it in silence than kind of getting distracted by maybe some incongruous music. So it definitely matters, because how an exhibitor chose to play these movies, would radically alter your feelings on what you thought of the movie.
I agree with all that stuff. I mean, you even look, I'm going to, a film festival in a few weeks, and just how you, if you're watching movies in a row, how you program them can affect how you watch something. And yeah, I mean, the music is a big effect. I mean, John Carpenter talks all the time about Halloween and how the movie just kind of really didn't work until he put the music in it. And, there's this whole history of just distributors and the movie theaters themselves just cutting movies out and doing whatever they wanted to them, because that's just what they did. They had their audience, or they had their own fucking weird morality about stuff. I mean, there's all the sorts of stories about these guys cutting out the nude scenes out of movies, not either because of morality reasons or because they were sex pests on 42nd Street, keeping them for themselves. I just think all that stuff is so interesting. Because, for another example, I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about the original Godzilla vs. Kong from the 60s. And they started talking about, it was really cool how they had this format where, they had news reports telling you the story. And I was listening to that going, oh, you watched the American version, because that's not the Japanese original version. You guys watched it on TV when you grew up, or maybe in this case, you guys got the Criterion set and didn't realize the disc is the American one. You have to go to the special features disc to get the Japanese cut. And for a lot of people, that version is their preferred version of Godzilla vs. Kong from the 60s. For others, like me, it's not my preferred version. I think it's not great, but it's interesting how these little things like that can really just fucking affect the hell out of things. I mean, shit, Michael Mann keeps editing his movies.
Well, I can give a real world example of something I think is crazy that reminded me. When I was reading about taking the gunshot scene and putting it at the beginning and the end, I thought of this. As Tom knows and Michael tell you, we both used to work at a movie theater in Brooklyn that would do a lot of rep screenings, and one night we were screening The Fugitive, one of the
God, yep.
quintessential action films of the 90s, right? And now, Mike, when you think of The Fugitive, what's the first scene that jumps to mind?
Well, it's I didn't kill my wife. I don't
Right.
care.
So imagine you paid money to go to a rep screening that was screening this on 35 millimeter from a print that had been borrowed from the Motion Picture Academy, and you're sitting, and you know that scene's about to happen, and then all of a sudden, out of the blue, it cuts to the next scene.
I'd be hopping mad.
Right.
Oh man, I'd be hopping mad.
Everybody was. So I'm only using this as the example. So what had happened was it had become clear that whether the print arrived too late or nobody had tested it, the print that we had borrowed from the Motion Picture Academy was one from which they had extracted scenes to use during the ceremony, one of which being the I didn't kill my wife scene. So instead, an offer was made to the audience as a compromise, which was we can either refund you or you can watch the rest of the movie on 35 millimeter, and then at the end, after the credits, we'll pull up that scene on YouTube and play it. Sure enough, a good chunk of the people stayed for that. And I just thought of that, like how funny it is to me, like imagining right, that's kind of what it was like to go see these movies back in the day when the exhibitor had more control. It was an accident for us, but somebody at the Eden Musée or at one of these old-time exhibition halls could just turn around and go, that waterfall, that whole, that I didn't kill my wife, I don't care scene, that's really exciting. That shouldn't be in the middle. That should be at the end. And they would just chop it up and chuck it at the end. That was what it was like. The Huber's Museum, which is the first place to screen the Great Train Robbery, which, again, for our New York friends, if you're wondering where the Huber's Museum was, the very first place that screened the Great Train Robbery, a dime museum, on 42nd Street. The address doesn't exist anymore, but it's somewhere between Madame Tussauds and Ripley's, believe it or not. But anyway, that could chop it up and just present it however they wanted. And just to put it in a modern context, just imagining that fugitive scene now thrown at the end because some exhibitor decided, why the hell not?
Well, I was also saying you skip. There's a bit skipping because everyone knew something was wrong immediately, because at the beginning of the movie when the train escape doesn't show up,
Yes,
people
right,
went,
yeah.
oh no, something's gone terribly, terribly wrong. But also just because I'm reading the J.W. Rinsler I just read that making of Star Wars book, and this is a thing I've talked to directors about too.
Great fucking book, by the way.
Oh, it's
Great
amazing.
book.
If you guys haven't read that book, I just got it after the man passed because I kept waiting to get him. I got most of, if not all of his making of books. Star Wars is great. I'm halfway through Planet of the Apes. Another one that's amazing. But a thing that George Lucas says, and I've talked to other filmmakers about, is that as a way to kind of make sure at least the studio doesn't mangle their movie and edit, they will make sure that the studio can't get either they don't shoot coverage, so all they have is what they want it to be edited like, or they just make sure the studio doesn't get a hold of the film until 2 weeks before the movie's supposed to air, so not giving them any time to edit the movie in some brain dead accountant's way they think is going to make them more money, So it feels like even since 1903, they kind of knew, all right, let's kind of just shoot it in a way where they can't fuck this up too much.
Yeah, it's truly fascinating. Now, one thing I want to note too about this film and how it holds up that I thought of, we were talking about the earlier films. So how the first crime film is arguably Chinese Laundry Scene, and how the earliest Western is arguably Kidnapping by Indians. If you watch Kidnapping by Indians or Chinese Laundry Scene, as you can imagine, there's some prominent elements of that are very uncomfortable, right? It's a thing that you kind of look at and you try and say, oh, it's a product of its time or whatever, but obviously there's some horrible racist caricatures in those. One thing I'll say to the credit of Great Train Robbery, Nothing like that.
No.
A 1903 action film that there is absolutely nothing that you look at and go, that's objectionable. Unless I'm
I'm sure
forgetting something, but,
somebody. No, I mean, I'm sure somebody today could kind of, go
take
make some.
take qualms with the
Uh,
violence, but.
well, take qualms with the posse killing the bad guys at the end and say, well, this movie doesn't realize that all cops are bastards.
But like truly, like think about the fact that you've got just the fact that this movie is from 1903, but you could still screen it to somebody today and it would still have all of the power that it had when it played. There's nothing about it that I think
Yeah.
particularly ages it. And I thought that was an
No.
interesting element,
The only thing that ages it, I think, and not in that way, because I agree with you, there's nothing like sort of morally or ethically objectionable about this movie, is just some of the death scenes, because they're still coming from that stage tradition. I do
Yeah.
feel like some of the death scenes are a little over the top. Like there's one guy that gets shot and then he gets shot in the train and he kind of does like puts his arms up and does like a little pirouette before he falls down.
Yeah.
But that again, so much of that is just because of the stage tradition that it comes from. But in terms of, I mean, it's honestly one of the most morally unobjectionable movies from before 1920 that I've ever seen in my life, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, and I mean, just another thing that kind of makes it feel kind of timeless, in spite of the pirouette gunshot victims, is for the longest time you couldn't in movies show in the same frame a gun going off and someone reacting to getting shot. It would have to be close up of the gun, it fires, and then a close up of a guy clutching his chest and falling down. Not here. I mean, this is all just in frame. Gun goes off, guy goes down, and I forget when the rule might have started going into play, probably in the 20s, maybe early 30s, when you couldn't do shit like that. So a lot of time, Bogart's shooting people not in the same frame with them. That shit doesn't come back till 69 when Peckinpah just blew everything off with the Wild Bunch, which, again, you could see a direct line between Great Train Robbery and the Wild Bunch, not just in the violence, but just story about bad guys getting their comeuppance at the end in the Wild West.
Another thing about, talk about the shooting, and this is something I want to hear you guys' thoughts on, that I thought was interesting, and it's a thing that I feel like we don't see in movies today, and I kind of wish we did. Outside the train, they've lined everybody up, they're taking their stuff, and one guy, if you remember, they shoot the one man, and he hits the ground, right? He clutches his chest, he hits the ground, and the bandits have got him all stuck up, and then the bandits take off, and then the crowd runs to the man who's been shot and wants to, try and help make sure he's okay. I feel like when you watch movies now, and like even going back further, for decades since, if somebody gets shot, unless they're our main character, if somebody gets shot, no matter where they get shot, everyone else around just assumes, well, that's it for them. Let's ignore the corpse. And I love that little element of like, even though this guy has been shot and he's been on the ground for a couple of minutes, the group still runs over to him as soon as the band is gone to try and figure out how to help him. And there's a real sense of desperation in that I think adds to the stakes of it. You're not just watching, by having them run over to that man, you're not just watching, sentient objects being robbed. You're watching people, and there's still an emotion to that, even though we don't know who that is that just got shot. We don't know how the people feel about him. There's just a humanity to it.
Well, it adds the realism to the story. I mean, because it's 12 minutes long, there's no dialogue. It has to be just pure and elemental, and it's doing what I said about the violence of the robbers before. It's character through action. We get to know that these people. We may not know the specifics of them, but they're not the robbers. They're the good guys. They have a morality to them that the robbers don't. It gives us the difference between the two. And, I mean, that's the shit we were taught in film school when we were making silent films. Yes, Mike, you have.
Sorry, yeah. Although I was going to say, I also think it's fascinating that the robbers do, again, being told through action, do have at least some sense of a morality, because they are not just wantonly killing people in this movie, right? They don't kill the station manager at the start of it. They tie him up, they knock him out. Their preference is to knock people out and tie them up. They only kill people, and they will, you're right, they will violently and without remorse kill people when they need to. But they do, for the movie, really try and avoid killing as many people as they can, which, again, I think to be able to convey that in 12 minutes is astounding to
Well,
me.
it's that again, it's that Michael Mann connection of like the beginning of Heat. They don't want to kill these guys, but then well, fuck, we got to kill them now. It's a little more vicious in this one, but yeah, it's building the character through action, which a lot of action movies these days don't really take into account when they do that, but 1903, these fucking guys did, and it's why it's important. It's why it's in the registry, and why it's still, frankly, watchable today. I mean, you're not going to confuse it with the next Gareth Evans picture, but it's watchable and it's entertaining, and it's just like, again, that Rosetta Stone thing of like shooting you back in time and then like getting through all of the like just the tendrils it's spread out throughout cinema history, where you just start like Doctor Strange flying through the universe. You're just like, okay, I get why this is so important.
Another thing we didn't touch on that I want to talk about with this is the art direction in this film. Mike, you made a great point about how there's always some kind of movement on screen, but another element I think is great is normally when you watch the older films that precede this, even the Georges Méliès films, which I love, they're very obviously in front of painted backdrops, and especially the earlier Edison films, there's not a lot of effort in terms of the art direction, except for some of Porter's previous films. It's typically just like a small flat, and it's like, we know what we're here to see. What I love about this film, especially when you go to the station manager's office, there's so many different things on the wall. There's so much detail put into this that your eye is always occupied by something. Even if we're in a situation where the station manager's tied up and trying to just like, wriggle himself out and get help, there's always something to occupy your eye. There's never a boring frame of this movie.
No,
There's nothing that's visually dull.
it's a lesson that the late great Tony Scott took in his last movie, Unstoppable. If we're on a train, trains are nothing but constant kinetic movement. Cinematically get that across by constantly moving, having the camera moving, having people moving, just the kinetic energy, make the audience feel the same way that the characters feel. And again, that connection. And yeah, this movie does it really well. It's just always, you just feel like the movie's just shot out of a gun right from the beginning, and it doesn't stop until the camera's turned back on you and that guy's firing right into your face.
Can we talk about that? I mean, does anybody else have anything to say before we talk about that shot and like that scene?
The only thing I wanted to add on what you said about the art direction, Mike, is this movie feels really lived in. Like, it feels like, in the best way, it's a world that exists outside of this movie, and we're just kind of dropping in, and that is, especially turn of the century, when literally they were in a lot of ways just kind of replicating stage plays. To have a movie that feels like it exists in the real world and feels that lived in, and all of that is through the set design, the art direction, all of that sort of stuff. That's no small feat in 1903, man. But yeah, other than that, let's talk about that last shot.
Well, first off, if you haven't watched this film and you're listening to the episode, go watch it. It will take you 13 minutes.
We've talked about it for 5 times longer than it takes to watch the movie.
Go on YouTube. Hell, we'll put it on our YouTube page. You can find it anywhere. Watch it. But of course, the scene we're referring to is this incredible shot of an actor, Justice D. Barnes is the name of the actor, who would act for a number of years and then retire and become, I believe, a milkman upstate. So imagine the man from arguably the most famous scene in cinema just delivering your milk. Justice D. Barnes looking directly at the camera, firing off some shots from his revolver, which Porter, notably, he didn't love close-ups. He felt you should only, or he didn't want to overuse them. He felt you should only use them in special occasions because it would be jarring for the audience. And this is certainly a jarring scene. Arguably, Barnes shooting the camera, I would say, is maybe the first jump scare in cinema, because it is just such a shocking image. So I just want to hear in general. We'll start with Mike and then Tom. Like, what are your guys' thoughts on just that shot and that scene? What does it mean to you, and how do you feel about it?
Putting yourself in the context of 1903, it's tremendous, right? Like, it just had to have scared. I mean, we're talking. I know it's an urban legend that the train arriving at the station made people freak out and flee and stuff. But I got to imagine in 1903, watching a dude point a gun at you and pull the trigger would be pretty unnerving. Honestly, it's a little unnerving now because it's still not a shot that we see replicated a lot, right? Even modern cinema, you very rarely see somebody fire directly into the camera. Because I don't know about you guys, but staring down the barrel of a gun is not a very comfortable position for me to be in. And so,
Speak for yourself.
and so I still think it has a lot of impact.
Yeah.
The way, and especially the way Barnes, he's so emotionless doing it. Like you're literally seeing what it would feel like to be one of the people that he has to kill in this movie, and the way he does it just without remorse. I still think it's like terribly effective, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's very effective, and especially yeah, in the context of 1903, like you said, it probably felt like wow. But even now, because one, it just kind of breaks the kind of quote unquote cinema language where taught is not what you're supposed to do. Like you're not supposed to look straight into the camera. You're not supposed to do anything like that. But also because it breaks in a way the language the movie has been using up to that point. No close-ups, none of that. It's all very third person. You're detached from everything. You're watching it from a distance, and then the movie breaks the fourth wall, brings you into the action, and kind of says, "Well, how would you feel if you were involved in this story instead of watching it safely from a distance?" Which, I think a lot of the best action or crime movies kind of like confront that element of, well, the violence isn't actually violence in general is just not actually fun. So like how do you feel now that we're kind of indicting you for watching the violence from a safe distance, getting entertainment from innocent people getting mowed down? And I mean, there's a reason why Scorsese used it at the end of Goodfellas, because that's kind of the big point of the end of that movie. It's, well, how do you feel now? It's making you really question your participation in the violence.
And it's funny you bring up, it's important to bring up Goodfellas because I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the fact that much like Mike was saying, like I find this shot in the best way unsettling still.
Yeah.
Even though it's over 100 years old, to find it unsettling. And I was thinking about, well, Scorsese replicates it at the end of Goodfellas. Why don't I find that as unsettling? And I think what it is Tom, you're 100% right talking about it breaking the rules of the movie. And I think part of that is there have been no close-ups. We don't know. I mean, maybe a historian who could pour through and pinpoint things, but as far as I know, when I watched Great Train Robbery, I couldn't point out to you which of the bandits is Justice D. Barnes. That face is not familiar to me. When I watch Goodfellas, I see Joe Pesci and I go, yeah, that's Joe Pesci. I've been watching him the whole movie. I know who this character is. I know all of this. And when he's firing the guns, in my head, I'm figuring out which scene that's supposed to be or whatever. Whereas with this, Mike talked about the remorseless face on Barnes. It's a face we don't know. It's a face that's not, we haven't been shown this face in close-up so many more times. So it's extra unsettling that this guy just popped up. Is he one of the bandits that we saw before? Is he a new kind of bandit? Like we don't, there's so much unfamiliarity there. He has no background. We've gone through a movie with so many detailed backdrops. There's no background behind him. It's so viscerally upsetting, even now, because of how unfamiliar it all feels.
Yeah, I mean, it's just storytelling, the cinematic buildup. That the pressure and release valve. I mean, it may not be an exact one-to-one comparison I'm about to bring up, but it reminds me of Carpenter's Halloween. I brought it up before, but you don't see Michael's face until like 20 minutes before the movie ends. I mean, you don't see that mask. He's always off from a distance. He's in the shadows. Even when he kills Linda and Annie, you never see his face until he comes up with the phone when Laurie's on the phone breathing, and you go, "Oh my God, it's this cold. It's literally death, white blank face," which is, like you're saying, the kind of feeling you get at the end of this movie. You don't know which one of the bandits this guy is, but then you get that close up of his cold, emotionless face looking you down, as he's firing at you, and it's powerful. It's another thing that filmmakers learned from this: pressure and release, the build up, and then let everything go. There's a time for everything. You don't want to overwhelm the audience with something, and yeah, I mean it's an iconic final shot for a reason.
Well, and Porter takes away, because we've watched all the bandits get killed, right?
Yeah.
Hoorah, good guys have won. The posse's killed all the big, and so we're sort of in this celebratory mood, and then all of a sudden this fucker's shooting us in the face, and
Yeah.
it's like, what the hell just happened here? Like, why am I, like, I feel like shit now. I was happy, and now I feel like shit, which is, sort of the way the best, like you said, Mike, jump scares or stingers or just anything that undercuts the conventional narrative should make us feel. We should be, feeling unsettled.
And just thinking about the metatextual thing of that shot, it also leaves you unsettled because it's putting you in the frame of somebody that's in front of this guy who's about to get killed, and then boom, he starts shooting, and then what happens? It cuts to black. The movie's over. You're dead now. It leaves you feeling unsettled because you now have that idea of mortality in your head in a way that some of the death scenes earlier in the movie don't have the same impact because, well, gunshot, cut to black, everything's over. That's kind of fucked up. That must have been real heavy for people in 1903. Heavy now, must have been really heavy seeing it kind of the first time back then,
I mean, did anybody else have this thing where while that was happening, they started playing Journey's Don't Stop Believing and then abruptly cut out, or was that just my version?
I think that was just you, buddy.
Oh,
I told you, man, you never know how an exhibitor's going to cut in music. It can radically alter the themes.
Well, it's also funny. Like I've mentioned Michael Mann a lot before, but I haven't seen many movies that have taken that idea of someone getting shot and then having it fade to black. I mean, he does that in Black Hat when Viola Davis dies. She's looking up at the cityscape of, I believe they're in Tokyo at this point, and she's dying, bleeding to death, and we see from her POV, and then it all just fades to black. And that really fucking affected me. It still affects me when I see it. Again, I think it's just it's just great. What are we doing? We're an hour and 13 and it's great.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to second that because the DNA of everything, so many of the movies that I love, from people like Jean-Pierre Melville to John Woo to Michael Mann, I mean, so much of their DNA is in this movie. If you are an action movie fan or a crime film fan or a Western fan, like, you owe it to yourself to watch this fucking movie because it literally, and I know one of the things when I was researching it is that was a pushback because there was this big myth built about it. And then a lot of film historians were like, it actually wasn't as influential as we were saying it was. I don't know whether it was or wasn't. I wasn't there. What I do know is that if you watch this, you can literally look and go, oh, okay, I see A Better Tomorrow in this, or I see The Wild Bunch in this, or I see Heat in this. And maybe we're retroactively doing that, but I don't give a shit. I mean, this movie is so fundamentally important and, frankly, just a hell of a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah.
So normally we wrap up these episodes talking about how these movies fared at the Oscars, but this is going to shock our listeners. Since the first Oscars happened in 1927, there were no Academy Awards given out for films of 1903.
You don't say.
What we decided to do to wrap this up is we are going to talk about our top 5 train scenes in movies. Each one of us picked our top 5 train scenes in movies, and I guess we will start. We'll start with our. If you're comfortable, Mike, we'll start with you, our guest, and then I'll go, and then Tom. Sound good for everybody?
Sounds about right.
Sounds good, yeah.
All right, so Mike, tell us your start. You want to go from 5 to 1?
Yeah, I didn't really order them too much, but I can do that on the fly. That's not a problem. And these are going to be ones that maybe they're not the best, but they're the ones that I always think of. When you first asked me to do this, I'm like, okay, I didn't even do any initially do any research. I just closed my eyes and I was like, think of trains in movies. And honestly, the amount of great train action scenes in movies are ridiculous.
Oh yeah.
But for my top 5, for my first one, I have got to go with, and I'm going a little more modern on most of my list just because I wanted to show how the influence is still being felt today. I'm going with the scene where Chris Evans is trying to shoot through the window at the guys who are trying to kill them in Bong Joon-ho's Snowpiercer.
Hell
I mean,
yeah.
Snowpiercer takes place entirely on a train, but I think that action scene is, as far as action goes, the high point of that movie. I absolutely love that scene and love that movie.
I mean, I'm gonna say it right now. Snowpiercer's on my top 5 too. I was gonna cheat and just say the entire fucking movie because
What, Tom? There was a rule that you decided you were going to try and skirt? Oh, golly.
Listen, I'm Italian. I don't follow the rules, baby. But yeah, I mean, Snowpiercer is just one of the best at just finding the dynamism of what you could do on a train. And yeah, that scene firing across as they're curving along is just it's a mind melter. It's one of the best, and you can't go wrong watching Snowpiercer at any point in the day. Any day, just throw on Snowpiercer. That's how me and Mike went to go see, tried to get into an early screening of Guardians of the Galaxy 1. We couldn't get in, so we were like, oh, that movie Snowpiercer's playing like a few blocks away. Why don't we go see that? And, the movie ended, I'm like, yeah, we made the right decision. Things worked out well karmically for us. For once in our lives, the universe was helping us.
So, Mike, what's your number 4?
So my number 4 is again kind of a bit of an outside the box, but honestly, it's a tremendous train scene, and it's the finale of Paddington 2. Because that is one of the best fucking train scenes that I have ever seen in my life. I mean, complete with Paddington using candied apples to walk across the train, and you've got Hugh, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he's got to do the splits across the 2 trains. I mean, there's nothing you could want out of a train action scene that the finale of Paddington 2 doesn't give you. I guess there's no guns, but other than that, there's nothing you could want out of a train action scene that Paddington 2 doesn't give you.
Well, this is obviously going to be Film Shorter's favorite episode of our show.
Well, listen, I think rather, Mike pointed out the only thing you might want is guns. If Paddington started packing heat, that might actually get Tom to start watching the movies.
Listen, if that little bear started assassinating fucking like Russian gangsters or whatever, and like using its size like Chucky to like just surprise people with how deftly violent it is, I'm there, baby.
No, but I agree with you, Mike. What a great pick of a scene. That is delightful. What's your number 3?
So again, I like, my list is like 20 movies long, so I'm trying to pick the ones that I think that there's little to no chance that anybody else on this show will talk about. Obviously, Snowpiercer didn't work out that way. This one's going to be a little bit of a break in the rule, following Tom's lead, because it's not technically a movie. I just rewatched it last night, and it's still one of the most delightful train action scenes I've ever seen, which is the finale of the Wallace and Gromit episode, The Wrong Trousers, where, I'm sorry, if you can watch Gromit grab the spare tracks and quickly put them down to try and get to the penguin and not just have joy in your heart, you're dead inside. I'm sorry. It's tremendously edited. It's incredibly well put together, and it's wonderful.
Oh, I loved those growing up. I can picture that scene shot for shot in my head as you named it. This is already my favorite bit we've ever done. This is already working out. I'm already delighted. What's your number 2?
All right, so my number 2, I would not be able to sleep with myself if I didn't name this one, because anybody that follows me on Twitter knows this is my favorite movie of all time. I'm not saying it's the best movie of all time, but it is my favorite movie of all time. So I have got to go with the elevated train fight scene between Peter and Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2. Sam Raimi's my favorite director, and that is like the culmination of everything that Sam Raimi does well. It's tense, it's incredibly well shot, and it tells an entire narrative in that one scene. I mean, just that one scene, because one of the things I've always argued with action movies is that fight scenes in and of themselves should tell a narrative. They need to move the characters forward. They need to be like musicals, where a fight scene moves everything forward. And there is so much character work being done in that scene, in addition to the incredible action that, frankly, hasn't been topped in a superhero movie yet, is just absolutely staggering.
Again, spoiler alert. That was on my 5.
Hey, Mike, can I also add to that? Remember how you said you were trying to pick the scenes that you didn't think either of us would pick? Man, you really goofed up with that one because it's on mine as well. We're all on the same
Sorry,
page.
guys.
No, that's spectacular. That shows you where everyone's head's at. You know, I'm sure the Far From Home trailer aided that too when we saw Molina again and all went, oh hey, remember how much Spider-Man 2 ruled?
Yeah, Spider-Man 2, I always tell people Spider-Man 2 is the only time in my life where, leading up to the movie, I had a movie in my head that I wanted Spider-Man 2 to be, and it is the only time in my life where I've ever gotten the movie that was in my head. Like, it literally, I left that movie and I was like, I could not have asked for anything different than what I got. That was the movie that I wanted in my head. Right down to, I even was like, please give some scene where Peter, like, gets his mojo back, and we get and then we get the great shot where he drops his glasses and clenches his fist, and oh my god, like, I just, even now I'm getting choked up about how much I love that
And
movie.
so what tops out for you your number one train scene in cinema?
So my number one is, and it was actually funny watching Great Train Robbery, and again, we kind of didn't mention it, but just how impressive the stunts on top of the moving train, even though it was obvious the train wasn't going very fast, how impressive the stunts on top of the moving train were, which made me realize, obviously I thought one, and I don't know if it'll be on one of your lists, but obviously I thought of The General, but you guys have already covered that. So instead I have to go with the heir apparent to Buster Keaton.
Oh, I know where you're going,
The
baby.
finale,
I know where
the
you're going.
finale of Police Story 3 Super Cop, I think, in my opinion, is the greatest train action scene that has ever been filmed. I mean, you got
Absolutely.
Michelle Yeoh jumping a motorcycle onto the train, Jackie Chan ducking helicopters. It's action perfection.
Absolutely. That was on my list.
Love it. Absolutely love it. I'm excited. I'm going to be revisiting all of the Police Story movies because my partner's sister is she's 11 and she's just getting into, or 10, I believe she's now. She's been taking karate classes. She's obsessed with martial arts action movies, and Mike, you and some other friends on Twitter were kind enough to make some recommendations as I try and find movies that have good fighting but are also appropriate for a child. It's more challenging than you folks might think. 80s movies have surprise boobs a lot.
Well,
It
they're
was
not surprise
really
boobs.
difficult.
If
It's
it's
true.
the 80s. If it's the 80s, just assume there are boobs that are going to show up, especially if it's a PG movie, because boobs can still show up.
Yeah, it was really difficult trying to come up with recommendations that weren't just like the obvious ones, So yeah, it was but I think we all kind of came together to give you a pretty good
she's
list.
so excited. It's very hyped. All right, so this I've got my top 5 train scenes, some of which will maybe be a surprise to some people, and some of which won't be. We've known each other long enough. None of these will be a surprise to Tom. My number 5 is from a franchise full of action scenes and a number of train scenes, but this is not only my favorite in that franchise, but it's my favorite fight scene in that entire franchise, which is going to be the train fight from Russia with Love when Bond is up against Red Grant. There's such an intimacy to it. There's such a tightness to it, a tension, enough that they attempted to replicate it in Spectre, and I feel like it just doesn't have the same power. It truly is like watching one of those Hitchcock train scenes, but heightened in violence and tension. Bond using his little choking wire in his watch at one point. It's just such a great work of tension without being hyper violent or without 1,000 cuts or anything like that. It just understands its environment and uses its environment so well.
Yeah, it was on my list.
Yeah, I almost just said Bond. I mean, that was one of my picks, was just Bond, because like it feels like train action scenes and Bond movies are so tied together. I mean, what? I think at least fully a third of the Bond movies probably have to have train-based action scenes in them, but I agree with you. Nothing ever comes close to that from Rush.
And to be clear, when we talk about train action scenes, I want the audience to know, I want you to feel the disappointment early. I did not include the train fight from Wild Wild West on my list. I hope that doesn't disappoint our listeners too much. I know you're
Fuck it,
all
I'm out.
expecting it.
I'm done. I'm going home.
Also, maybe don't just Google best train scenes, because that might lead you down different paths.
God. All right. My number 4, we don't need to say too much more about, because my number 4 has already popped up on Mike's list. It's the fight from Spider-Man 2. Just the best. I there's not much more to add, but truly one of the best fight scenes in superhero cinema.
I mean, yeah, it rules. Like, just after the No Way Home trailer came out, and people were just like posting the train fight from Spider-Man 2. It was like, let's just remember that none's top Spider-Man 2's train fight scene. Just watching it, even on a fucking tiny ass phone on Twitter, I'm just like, yeah, this is the good shit.
Well, because it really, one thing about it is that it understands that why we love comic books is those giant splash pages that understand that when you're looking at a fight in a comic book, it's because you want to see some action that understands spatial geography, action that understands possibilities within this fictional world. You've got a guy with robot arms and a guy that can shoot webs. Your environment should be conducive to those powers and abilities. It shouldn't all just be in front of green screens with like gray rocks in the background. Like you can build your environment to best interact with those powers.
See, you say that's why you watch comic book cinema. Me, I watch comic book cinema so I could watch a guy from Fiddler on the Roof fight the asshole from Molly's Game.
And there's so much of a tactile feel to it. Hit actually hurt. It's like when they're fighting on the side of the train and you're seeing it from the inside of the train and their feet are just clonk, clonk, clonking on the side of the train. And you're really hearing the impact of those punches and those hits. It just everything. And I love modern comic book movies. I am not an MCU hater, but everything feels so light and weightless, and nothing about that scene feels weightless in Spider-Man 2.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I don't hate modern comic book movies the way some people feel they need to do because they weren't 15 when they came out. But there is a vast difference between, like, I think there's good action scenes in the MCU, but like you just watch the way Raimi uses the camera as compared to the way others use the camera, because Raimi was actually using the camera. He wasn't a second unit guy that was shooting it because they pre-produced action scenes 2 years before they started filming. This is just the best. Like, he's just a pure cinema guy. He just knows how to shoot a goddamn movie, and it just feels like you're right in the middle of that scene, just zipping along, and just Spider-Man 2. Oh God, I might watch that today. Fuck it.
My number 3, we Mike touched on it, and I had to include it. We talked about it last season, so there's not too much more to say. But I did have to put the General. I felt it was undeniable, just the physicality of what Buster Keaton is doing, and the way that he can make a scene that is both viscerally thrilling from an action standpoint and also very funny is remarkable. So him on the front, just like hitting up the thing. Oh, it's so good.
It's amazing. Yeah, no, it was really the only reason I didn't include it on mine was, like I said, because you guys had already covered it. But if people listening, like, you gotta see the General. It's just, and it's one of those where do you even pick a scene? You just, the entire fucking movie is the train scene.
Yeah, that's why I didn't pick it, and I also knew Mike was gonna pick it, so I figured, fuck it, just let him. We'll discuss it when Mike brings it up. So
there's also, I'll say this: there's no way Tom doesn't already know what the next 2 coming from me are. It's just a matter of the order. So my number 2 is from a movie I think might be the greatest movie ever made. If I'm going to talk about trains in cinema, I have to talk about this, even though it's not a fight scene within a train or anything like that. It's Lawrence of Arabia. Blowing up the train tracks.
I knew that was coming.
The train derails, and then you have one of my favorite shots in film, just Peter O'Toole just dancing and flowing with the wind along the top of this derailed train like this gleeful god of war. It is this incredible thing to witness that it's in the moment when they blow up the tracks. you realize, you think of it almost like a David conquering Goliath thing, these scrappy rebels taking down this powerful army. But then to watch Lawrence dance along the top, you come to realize that maybe he knows it, maybe he doesn't, that in his mind, this isn't about fighting back anymore. It becomes about conquering. It's this incredible moment where this train can symbolize so much in this one moment. So my number two is just the train in Lawrence of Arabia.
I have always said that one of my favorite things about Lawrence of Arabia is it is the story of this man, this incredible man who does this amazing thing for all the wrong reasons. And that scene perfectly encapsulates that. Like, that is the scene where you're really like, oh no, this isn't about Lawrence this is just about Lawrence being Lawrence. Like, he's a megalomaniacal, douche kind of. And that scene really encapsulates that. That is a great pick. And it's a movie that I don't revisit as much as I should just because it's so long. And also, can I really quickly say, has any director ever made Blue Eyes look as good as David Lean makes Peter O'Toole's eyes look in that fucking movie?
Tom knows my favorite scene in any movie is just that close up on O'Toole's face and watching just the eye acting he does when he's about to yell "No prisoners." Perfect. And my number one, I'll give a little preface here, folks, to explain why it's my number one and why I love it so much. Have you ever watched a movie and it's not going well? And you're going along and going, Jesus, okay, they're making some choices here, but I get it. I guess you couldn't do the thing that I want it to do. The thing I want it to do is too old-timey. The thing I want it to do is too old-fashioned. The thing I want it to do is X, Y, Z. Yeah, Tom knows where we're going here. So I had this experience with a movie that I love that I'm one of the very few people who does love it. But it is my favorite train scene anyway. So there I am, about 2 hours deep into the 2013 film The Lone Ranger, which at this point has had a very kind of subdued score and is very concerned with being kind of dark and murky and very like Pirates of the Caribbean, but in the Old West. And the whole time I'm sitting there going, no, are you just trying to do like modern Lone Ranger, whatever? And there is a moment when the girl gets kidnapped, she's on the train takes off, somebody yells, and all of a sudden it plays. And the William Tell Overture plays just like it did in the old Lone Ranger films and the old radio show. And thus begins a 13-minute action sequence of the Lone Ranger and Tonto chasing down this train set to the William Tell Overture. And for 13 glorious minutes, about the length of the Great Train Robbery, you have a movie that is suddenly unashamed of what it is, unashamed of its source material, willing to risk looking hokey. There's some comedy beats, there's some straight up action beats. They're shooting guns to the rhythm of the William Tell Overture. There's the damsel yelling, but she punches the guy. It's everything that I would want that to be. It's everything that old movies used to do that modern blockbusters are too afraid to do, to wear their heart on its sleeve. It's so good that to me it overwhelms the rest of the film and makes me love it. It's so good that I'm pretty sure that's why it ended up on Tarantino's best of the year list. That sequence is so goddamn good, and it's everything that I want from a train chase. So my number one train scene of any film is from Gore Verbinski's The Lone Ranger. I don't think that's on anyone else's list. Yeah. So Tom knew where that was going.
Yeah, I knew it. Son of a bitch.
It was actually on my long list because I had the exact same. I was in agony watching that movie. I was hating every second of it. And then that scene started and it happened. And like you said, for 13 glorious minutes, I was just in heaven. Which, unlike you, where it's so good that it made you go around to liking the movie, for me, it had the opposite reaction. It's so good it made me go around to being even more fucking pissed off at how shitty the rest of the movie is. But that scene, and like you said, it's the same length as the Great Train Robbery. And that's what I do when I revisit it. I just treat it as like, this is a Lone Ranger short film that was made in like 1946. And it's just a 13-minute Lone Ranger short film. But that scene is so fucking perfect. It is so perfect. Yeah, that I mean, I certainly cannot fault you for picking that number one.
Yeah, I mean that's another reason why I knew Mike was gonna pick it. Didn't even decide to put it on my long list, but yeah, it's such a great chunk of filmmaking that it like Mike, it made me so angry at the like never-ending string of bullshit that 3-hour movie it is just keeps throwing at you, and you just wish like God, I wish Gore Verbinski had a good writer and a good editor and a good producer to tell him, hey, why don't we whittle this down to the good stuff and not, Johnny Depp as Old Man Tonto and all this weird grimdark shit that was left over from when the script still had magic in it. Why don't we just focus on the Lone Ranger being, the Lone Ranger? It's a great fucking action scene. Whatever bullshit I could throw at Gore Verbinski, that fucking guy, he knows how to shoot an action scene.
So Tom, let's wrap it up with your top 5 train scenes. I know we've heard a few already from other lists, but
all right. So because some of them I did a little adjusting on the fly because fuck it. We talked about those movies already, so we're gonna do some new movies. Okay. So I wanted to have a little variety with these and have each scene have a little different action flavor to them. So I'm gonna say my number 5, even though there's no real order to these in terms of quality. I'm gonna say number 5. A different comic book train scene that I think is actually really great, pretty underrated in the action scene discussion. Even if the movie itself isn't great, it's fine, but this is a shining light in the middle of it. The bullet train fight from The Wolverine, I think, is actually really fucking great. It's just the way it's shot. Mangold shoots it well. You just get the sense of the speed of the train. Wolverine's power, not just with the claws, but just his strength and his intelligence at how he defeats these bad guys on the train. I think it's just a pretty dynamite sequence in a movie that could have used maybe one more dynamite sequence like it, but I think it's a great scene. And the Wolverine, great train scene.
It's my favorite Wolverine scene of any of the X-Men movies. It's my favorite Wolverine fight scene.
I can't be mad at you about that. I can't be mad at you about that. Yeah, it's a great fight sequence. Absolutely. Other Mike, do you have any opinions on the bullet train scene?
Can I tell you, it's been so long since I have seen The Wolverine, and that's what I'm saying. Like, she and I have been doing these films, and when we watched X-Men Origins, I just was kind of telling her, I promise it's going to get better. Stick with it, like with these Wolverine films, because
you have got to watch the extended cut of the Wolverine. Do not watch the theatrical. Watch the extended cut. The theatrical is hot garbage in the third act. The extended cut makes it much better.
I remember what I loved about that in particular. What I loved about film was just that it did feel unapologetically pulpy in a lot of senses. And when you talk about that scene, like that is a kind of thing that it's willing to just kind of, like we talked about with Lone Ranger, that it is willing to wear its heart in its sleeve and kind of just be like, there's no sense of self-consciousness to it. It just goes for it, which I really appreciate.
So, my number 4, it was briefly talked about, but it wasn't anyone's pick. So I'm gonna say my number 4 to get this feeling in my list is the train fight sequence from Spectre. I think it's a lot closer to the quality of From Russia with Love than a lot of people might want to admit, because the rest of the movie, similar to Lone Ranger, is bullshit. But I think it actually manages to kind of do what that From Russia with Love scene does, but with a little more, I don't want to say pep or make it seem like it's better, but I just love how completely overwhelmed Bond is in this fight sequence. I mean, he feels a little more measured up to Robert Shaw in From Russia with Love, but against Batista, he's just out of his element. There's moments where you see it on his face where he knows, I'm fucked. And he's just scrambling, trying to figure out some way to stop this absolute behemoth that's coming his way. It's like a train is on the train coming after Daniel Craig. And it's quick, it's vicious, it's just destructive. It's the one shining light of action in a movie where the action is almost comically lifeless. I think it's actually pretty dynamite, and wanted a little Bond action on my list, so there you go, Spectre.
I saw Spectre once, and so I don't actually have much. I remember that scene being pretty good, but I unfortunately on this one don't have a ton to add to it.
Yeah, it's fine. It's not a good movie, so I don't know. I watch I rewatch Bond movies religiously. I'll throw them on as background noise. In Spectre, I get that feeling of just like, not today, not today. Maybe sometime, but not today. Not like this.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I said my thoughts on From Russia with Love. I think it's probably one of my favorite scenes in that film. But it's
It's the best scene in the film.
Yeah. I think maybe I have the feeling with the Spectre train scene that you do about the Lone Ranger, where it's just like it just makes me realize like what happened here.
Yeah. Yeah, not good. So we're going to go to my number 3. And we're getting a little martial arts and a little blood in my list right now, because we're going with Hammer Girl's fight on the subway in the Raid 2.
Yeah.
Fuck yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
That is a moment. And this is a movie where you're just lousy with amazing action sequences that you could pluck them out and say, this is the best action sequence ever. No, this is actually the best action sequence ever. But that moment in the Raid 2, where they're doing the Godfather intercutting between all the hits that are going on, and you see Hammer Girl, and for the first time, you realize what her whole shtick is, and she just pummels the fucking shit out of all of these guys on the train. It is electric. It uses the space to its advantage. It's brutal. It's quick. It's just, Gareth Evans is the fucking best, and yeah, when I heard train sequence, it may not be my number 1, but the Raid 2, that sequence is, oh boy, so good. Hammer Girl, crush me with your hammers, baby. That's the one thing I wish The Night Come For Us has. So just to have Timo's version of like Evil Dead 2 cranked to 11 style violence on a train.
Yeah, man. I mean, Julia Estelle's amazing. That movie's amazing. Like, I have nothing to add, because I mean, I think it's pretty well known how much I love the Raid 2 and how much I love Julia Estelle. So, I mean, that's terrific.
Yeah.
Now, Tom knows my deep love for Raid 2, but it's paired with the fact that I am one of the probably few people who, when the first Raid came out and was getting all the buzz, I saw it and I was not a huge fan of the first Raid. Which I know is heresy to say, but I was not a huge fan. So when the Raid 2 was coming, Tom and I went to see it, and I just remember feeling like, all right, let's see, but I'm sure I'm gonna walk out unfazed. And that movie has a magic and a power to it that just drew me in, and I adore it. It's one of my favorite action films, and Tom's right, that Hammer Girl sequence is just visceral and powerful and just knocked me out when we first saw it. I was raving about that movie.
Yeah, it's the best. So number 2 for me, going a little outside of the lines here, surprise, surprise, but I think it falls within the line of the parameters we've set. It is, in my opinion, the best car chase sequence of all time.
Mm-hmm.
The sequence from The French Connection, where Gene Hackman as Popeye Doyle is flying down the streets of Brooklyn, trying to catch up to the elevated train, while one of the French drug dealers had just tried to assassinate him. And just, I mean, in its own way, by bringing the action down to the car, and that by having the train being elevated, but just having the speed and the recklessness of what Gene Hackman's doing on those roads in Brooklyn, crashing into shit, just like a fucking madman. And you even get the added benefit of what the assassin's doing in the train. Like, he's getting into fights, he's shooting people, he's trying his best. And it's just, like I said, I think it's the best car chase sequence in all of cinema. I don't think anything's topped it. And by adding that element of the train, it gives it such a flavor that no other chase scene in general has ever had. And I just think it's just absolutely just dynamite. I sometimes just throw French Connection Blu-ray in just to watch the car chase sequence, just to give me a shot to the heart of adrenaline. It's the best.
Yeah, it's Well, and it's so unique compared to both car chases and train scenes, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's so unique, and it's so, again, it's Friedkin, so it's visceral. You know, he's probably trying to kill 57 people while filming it. I mean, it
Yeah.
just, and again, it's another one of those where action scenes need to tell a narrative. They have to have their own internal narrative, and that
Yep.
movie 100, or that scene 100% does. The characters are different after that scene than they are when they start, and yeah, I love it.
Well, so, Tom, what's your number one? No, I'm not the biggest French Connection guy. Tom knows this. We've, when Tom talks about not, thinking it's the greatest car chase, I think back in college we started arguing about whether French Connection or Bullet had the better car chase, and I think we're still arguing that 13 years later. But I agree with you guys insofar as I mean, I think it is visceral, and I do appreciate the way that it tells a story, and quite frankly, I will happily watch. Much as I'm not a French Connection fan, I will happily watch that scene anytime it's on.
And just like Mike said, it was William Friedkin, so he shot that scene on the
Yep.
streets of Brooklyn without a permit. So that was actually people getting the fuck out of Gene Hackman's way. So my number one is something that's been mentioned on the show before, something mentioned earlier this season, actually. My number one pick is the end sequence of John Frankenheimer's The Train, when it feels like the Nazis are actually going to get away with all of the art on the train, that Lancaster's the last man of this resistance standing that's been trying to stop them from getting all that art out back to Berlin. And Lancaster is further ahead up the tracks, and he's fucking with the tracks trying to stop them. And then you get that great moment where the Nazis don't realize what's about to happen until it does, and that fucking nutjob Frankenheimer actually derails an entire goddamn train, and Lancaster comes out on top. And nobody was like Frankenheimer in his prime, man. I know Mike probably has a lot of love for Frankenheimer's action filmmaking. I mean, he did what, Chaplin wanted to do. It's like, no, we're going to actually crash a goddamn fucking train. He crashes 2 goddamn trains in this movie, I should say. Ugh. And it's just tactile, it's visceral, and it's just that tension of, is Lancaster going to do it? Is he going to do it? Is he going to stop the fucking Nazis? And he does. And it's a great fucking, I want to see this movie in a theater, just with an audience where everyone just goes nuts when that train derails. Oh, I love it. Frankenheimer, you're the man.
Man, I was so hoping I was going to make it. I thought I was so close to getting out of this episode without a movie coming up that I hadn't seen before. But fuck it, Tom. You just ruined it for me. I have not seen The Train. I am going to have to now immediately seek it out because I am a massive John Frankenheimer fan. This is one that's been on the list for a long time, and I just never got around to seeing it.
It just got a great Kino Lorber disc earlier this year, maybe late last year, but it's a great disc. It looks great, sounds great. I think you're gonna be in heaven watching Burt Lancaster as obviously a French resistance fighter.
It's on my list to watch as well because Tom actually picked it last season as one of the films that because at the end of every episode we pick films that we are going to nominate to the registry. At the end of last season, we actually submitted our nominations, so John Frankenheimer's The Train has officially, formally been submitted for consideration to be inducted into the National Film Registry, which means if it happens, I might as well get around to watching it. So, Mike Scott, you will watch it. I will watch it. Our audience, you guys all watch it, and you can let us know on Twitter what you think of it. So on that note, Mike, do you have a Twitter and a show and all these things that you want to plug before we sign off?
Sure thing. You can follow me personally at Hibachi Justice on Twitter and Letterboxd. You can follow the Adkins Undisputed show on Twitter at Adkins Podcast, or the easiest way to find us is to just go to Linktree/Adkins Undisputed Pod. The podcast itself is everywhere you can hear podcasts.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so thrilled you came on for this. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, this was so much fun.
This was a blast.
We also may have more than quadrupled the length of the Great Train Robbery in talking about it, which only speaks to the film's impact. I hope that folks check out Adkins Undisputed. I've been thoroughly enjoying it. I look forward to what's ahead. And please, look, if you need somebody to talk about when Scott kick flips a football into the back of a net in the Pink Panther 2006, you know where to find me is all I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we still need to get Action Cat on at some point.
That's,
we've been talking about that for a while. We got to get Action Cat on at some point.
That is absolutely true. I will let you know. She has a lot to contribute by going because she doesn't know how to meow. That's 100% true. She's grown up around a dog. She doesn't know how to meow. But listen, she's available. She's got a high rate, but we'll try and work it out. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining us. And everybody else, stick around. We will be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration, on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks. So boys, to wrap up like we usually do, what films would you include in the registry? A reminder to our listeners, it must be an American film that's at least 10 years old.
So we talked a lot about the Great Train Robbery's place as an action film. And for a while, my line of thinking was, well, just pick another significant action movie. And I had a couple in mind that were like, well, here's a great action movie that isn't in the registry. And for whatever reason, it wasn't sitting right with me. And then I rewatched this again, and one of the elements that stuck with me about the Great Train Robbery is its narrative. It's the fact that it's full of visceral thrills. It is a crowd-pleasing film. It is, purely spectacle, but it has a message at its core about how crime doesn't pay. Like that's its message at the end of the day. Is you're watching bad people pull off a heist, pull off some crime, and then in the end, you watch them get gunned down. It may be a simple message, and it may be a message a lot of people miss, but it's still a message at the heart of this film. And so that got me thinking of another film that is very much a spectacle. It's very viscerally thrilling. It is massively popular. And at its core is, again, a very simple message about how crime doesn't pay, how these criminals get their comeuppance in the end. And on top of that, I was thinking about the ending shot of Justice T. Barnes shooting the camera and all the things that it influences. And this film that I'm picking for the registry has a very famous scene of somebody, our main character, holding a gun and shooting it toward the camera in a way. And it's a movie that I'm surprised isn't in the registry because of its cultural impact. But the movie it's a remake of is in the registry. And that is Brian De Palma's Scarface. It is a movie that I've discussed with Tom. It's the only movie I can think of that is both terrible and a masterpiece insofar as there's elements of it, like the accents, things like that you can say are totally hacky. And I do not begrudge anybody who watches De Palma's Scarface and goes, that movie's bad. I get it. It maybe is, but also when you watch it, it's so masterfully done. It's such a crowd pleaser. It's so visceral. It's so engrossing. My entire disdain for America in the 1980s is summed up in the push it to the limit montage. But I think that there's a great parallel there about the fact that at the end of the day, Scarface is kind of, the ending of the three of these, these bandits getting shot to death in the woods, kind of unceremoniously by a posse, with Tony Montana face down in the pool, with the world is yours above him. Like, there is a very simple message of crime does not pay at the core of Scarface, a movie that is viscerally thrilling. And there is that same kind of indictment of, in the same way that we talked about with Great Train Robbery, ending with shooting you, kind of criticizing you for how swept up you got in watching these guys commit crimes, even though it's wrong. Scarface is a movie that is very much telling you, like, yeah, look, you're loving watching this. And so many people have the Scarface poster, the James Franco and Spring Breakers, I got Scarface on repeat shit going on, who seemingly missed the whole point at the ending. I think that it's a stirring indictment of a lot of things about American politics in the 80s. There's a lot going on in that movie, but at its core, it's the same simple message that was being conveyed by Edwin S. Porter, almost 80 years prior to the film. So I think Brian De Palma's Scarface absolutely should be in the registry.
Cannot argue with that. Great movie. Definitely the argument is there, and I approve. So For my pick, I was struck by so much of the movie. I was struck by how for it 12 minutes, and it's not much of the runtime, but when it comes to 12 minutes, it's actually a hefty percentage of the runtime. It's about the process of how these guys rob the bank. It's the process, not the bank, the bank, the train, idiot. It's the process of what they do, tying up the manager, getting them to do the water, and then sneaking on, and then tying everybody up, and all that, and just they got to blow up the trunk. They got to get all the people off. They're gonna rob them, and all of that. How there's that code with the gangsters. How there's the code, just the humanity of it all, and then the cross-cutting at the end, all of that stuff, and how I mentioned it before, how this thing just spread its tendrils out throughout history. You could see it through everything. But the pick that I think I have to go with, which also ties into Mike's view of this movie being about crime doesn't pay. It's a movie that, for as short as the Great Train Robbery is, this movie is long. I am choosing a movie I'm also surprised is not in the film registry. I'm choosing Michael Mann's Heat. I just see so much of Heat in the Great Train Robbery. I see that opening armored car robbery, and how they have to kill the cops because, well, Wayne Grow killed the other guy, so we can't have witnesses. How they'll kill without remorse if they have to, but they're trying not to. I think the iconic bank robbery scene is very reminiscent of this movie in general. For all the planning, for all that they try to do, things go wrong, people die, and it becomes a mess. I think about the cross-cutting between the cops, between Pacino and De Niro, reminiscent of the cross-cutting at the end between the posse and the gang. How it ends with the gang, they all die. Except for Val Kilmer's character, but how it ends with the Al Pacino gunning De Niro down because De Niro's the great train robber, and he's just going to keep robbing trains, and he has to get stopped because that's the only way this guy can go. And I just see so much between the two. I see a lot of Michael Mann in the Great Train Robberies, but I had to pick one, and I'm picking his greatest movie, his most influential movie, the movie that is most touched by the Great Train Robbery. I think Heat needs to be in, and I think paired with the Great Train Robbery, it's the right pairing.
Let's all go to the lobby.
Thank you again to Mike Scott for joining us. Next week, we're giving you an episode you can't refuse. We honor the 50th anniversary of The Godfather with special guest Patrick Willems. Don't forget to follow the show on Twitter and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Here on You're Missing Out.
They honor movies of historical, cultural, or aesthetic importance on the National Film Registry.